Alright, so if we start from the new scene, we don't need lighting or any object. So delete those. If I select the camera and hit Alt R and Alt G, it'll replace where it goes, and then I'll hit R to rotate, X to lock it to the X axis, and then 90 just to get it flat. Then I'll hit G, Y to lock it to the Y, move it back here. So that'll be our starting spot. There's a plugin that I use called Image to, what is it called? Image to something. Image to plane, I think. Import images as planes. You'll want to add that because it makes it a lot easier to do this. Just click on it and then it should install. It's bundled with Blender. So then I'm going to take, I'm going to have my origin there and hit Shift A to add image, and then images as planes. Find your image. In my case, I'm going to add this logo for our little league here. So it's a PNG, so it's transparent, which is nice. You won't see it unless you do something like material preview or render. And it's probably good to do render because you're going to do some color correction in the compositor. And so if you go ahead and just render that out hitting F12, you'll see it's real dim. What we want is we want to be able to do the environment just as essentially as full white, which kind of will wash this image out. So what you'll do is if you hit F12 again to render it, and then go to the compositing tab, hit use nodes. We're going to stretch these out a little bit. Hit Shift A to add, and then add a color, a brightness and contrast one. This really should be all you need. You can also split this window if you want to see the rendered output. Select image editor and then render result. If you add a little bit of brightness and then a little, I think 10 contrast wise, that gives it that pop that it should have. I think that looks okay to me. That's all. And so essentially, once the compositor is set up, it will do the compositing every render. So you shouldn't need anything else. Go back to layout here, hit escape to get out of the render. I'm going to split this window, and I'm going to hit in this with my mouse over this one. I'm going to hit 0 on the number pad, and this will give me the camera view. So if you look here, as I zoom, move this around, if I hit Y, it'll zoom in, zoom out. And then you obviously want render mode on this one so you can kind of see what it looks like. So I'm gonna, if I start here and I get it, get it positioned where I want it, then what we want is, if we want to be able to have a control over the blur effect on the camera, and you can adjust the camera too, like if you want 35mm camera, whatever, you can do all sorts of things with that. You don't have to adjust that though. But you do want, if you want a blur effect, you want depth of field, and you can check that. And what you can do is actually add to the scene, so Shift A over here, and add an empty. So this is something that won't render, and add like, a sphere makes sense to me because I can position it. I'm going to scale it down a little bit so I have not quite so much filling up. And what you'll see here is if we go back to the camera and then tap this and select the empty, it'll be blurry. And so as far as depth of field goes, if I move this along the y-axis, you'll see it gets blurrier or more in focus. And essentially this is the setup for the scene. So depending on what you're doing here, if you do a 35mm camera, if you do different f-stops, or whatever, the f-stop will be the thing that determines how blurry it gets and how close the empty has to be to the image to get it to be clear. But you can see, so you can start out just with this, and what we're going to do is animate this. So I'm going to pull this up a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. I have the empty selected. I hold shift down and click the camera, and then what I'm going to do is on the first frame I'm going to lock this as a keyframe. So I'm going to hit the I key, and then because we're doing different locations and rotations, we'll track both over time. So we'll do location and rotation, and I have both selected so I can just kind of move them in parallel to different spots. So once that's done, then I'm going to move to another frame. We'll say, and you can adjust your output, like frame rate here on output properties, and however big you want to. But so I'm going to move to another frame, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust. So maybe I want to get, maybe I just want to make this go into focus. So I'm going to move this along the y-axis till it's in focus. Move it just to there, and I'm going to, because I want to track these in parallel, I want to do select both again. So I hold shift down to click them, and then hit I, and then essentially from now, so now if you watch the render, you have some motion going. If you have a case where it's like, all right, I zoomed that in and it looks good, now I want to cut to a specific scene, what we're going to do is a little hackery here. I'm going to move this over so I can kind of select, I'm going to select this specific marker, hit Shift D to duplicate, and just drag it over just 1 or 2 frames. And you'll see why in just a minute. But then, so now that will copy that position, but there's some other things we can change. So now if I want to go from here and I want to cut immediately to, let's say, panning across the logo, I can hit 7 to go to a top view, and then I can move the camera kind of and position it. There's different ways you could move the camera, but let's say you want to do a little bit of a drag across the logo like that. We'll start there, okay. And once again, because you have this, you have the capability to adjust focus based on where the empty is. I'm going to put it kind of behind. So I want this to be completely in focus for the whole thing. So I'm just going to link those two. Select both again. Hit I. Location, rotation, and then you begin your panning, and you say, all right, we're going to move. It's 24 frames a second, so you figure go a little bit of a ways, and then I'm going to move my camera along here, rotate it back, kind of get it to where I want it. You can see it's going out of focus because this is still in the same position. So essentially this will, then I hit I again, and so what you'll see is you'll see some amount of motion going on. If you get this weird effect where it's clipping, that's a function of the camera, and what you have to do is you have to select the clipping to be a little bit lower. So like this would be like millimeter depth, so that'll get rid of that if you're too close to the object issue. But you can see that motion looks pretty good. If you go back to frame 1 and you hit spacebar, it'll rotate, and do it in real time. So if it's too fast, all you really need to do, because it's doing extrapolation of positions and rotations, you just click on this keyframe here and just drag it out, and what that'll do is that'll give some extension for the interpolation, so that you get a little bit slower motion. So if you go back here, a little slower. So the distance between them, it's also a function of the frame rate. So if you have more frames, or less frames, it'll go slower too. And then other than that, that's really the two effects: just moving the camera around, and then so if we do those two, that kind of gives you all the stuff. If you want to do this cut from here to here, this obviously, if you do this, it's like a really weird, abrupt, like flash of stuff. So what we're going to do is in that one, we're going to highlight this, and then we're going to go to the timeline editor here. Not timeline, graph editor, sorry. This is the timeline. And what you can see is you can see these down here, you have that. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell that, I'm just going to right click in here and say interpolation mode constant. And what that'll do is then when I go here, it goes from this and immediately cut. So it, this would be a cut in cinematography terms. Cut immediately to that location and rotation. And that will then progress. So quick and easy way to do that. You could also set up multiple cameras and all this other stuff. This is way easier to just do this. And that is, as they say, that.